Hello, thank you for coming to this afternoon, lovely lunchtime session. Next up, we have, obviously, the wonderful Mr. Rob Hopkins, co-founder of the Transition Movement, certainly the spokesperson and the voice of it, and the face, of course. A very handsome face, Rob. Very nice. I don't think he needs that much introduction. I'm sure he can do it better than I ever could. But I'd just like to a warm round of applause for Mr. Rob Hopkins.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. So I'm Rob Hopkins from Transition Network and from Transition Town Totnes. And I'm going to do something today which is hopefully something for people who have been around it for a while, and also people for whom this is your first introduction to transition. So it'd be useful just to get a sense. So how many people here are already active in transition projects? Okay, and how many people know there is a transition project happening near them that they haven't kind of got involved with? Okay, and how many people don't know what on earth I'm talking about? Good man yourself. Okay, right. Okay, okay. So I'm going to. The title of this talk was "Transition in the UK," which I thought was quite interesting. It wasn't the title that I thought up, but it's it's interesting because there's a suggestion in there that actually what we're talking about is we need to create a transition. We need to get a transition underway, but of course there is already the most extraordinary transition happening around us anyway over the last 3 or 4 years, which is sort of gathering pace, but because we're in the middle of it, it can be harder to actually keep a tab on actually how quickly things are moving. But what I want to look at in this presentation is really about how it looks. Because when we started transition about 4 or 5 years ago, the idea was, could we create something which over time would become the tools that people would pick up as things got more and more difficult? And so what I want to do is to look and reflect on that. And so I wanted to start with a quote. And it's a quote by Milton Friedman, he who created neoliberal economics and who Naomi Klein in her book Shock Doctrine sort of pulls to pieces. But he said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And of course, what Milton Friedman was talking about, what those things might be that are lying around on the table at the time, would be very different from what a lot of us would imagine should be the things. But what I want to go on to talk about is where we're starting to see what transition has already developed within a short period of time, starting to be the things that people are picking up. So the context of what I want to talk about is in 2008, I wrote a book called The Transition Handbook. And I'm just finishing off, it's the sequel to that, which is called The Transition Companion, that'll be out in October this year. And what we did for that was to go back and look at what everybody was doing. So it wasn't that I just locked myself away in a little room somewhere and wrote out something. It was very much a collaborative process which drew from what people all over the world were doing, and how the model had gone out and what people were actually doing with it, what were their stories, what was working, what wasn't working, and then we've tried to pull all of that back in a much more useful model, which we'll go on to look at in more detail as we go through. But just as a recap, so transition is really a response initially to 3 things, so to peak oil, to climate change, and to what's happening economically at the moment as well. So since we wrote the first book, the International Energy Agency have said, oh, actually, yes, having spent the last 20 years saying peak oil is not an issue at all, have said, oh, and we peaked in 2006 in conventional oil production, by the way, just stuck in a little sentence in a document that they put out. And that whole issue has gone from being very much a fringe issue to a much more mainstream kind of an issue. Climate change continues to accelerate, and any of those of you who spend your days with your nose in the papers that are coming out on climate change will know the gravity and the seriousness of that. And in terms of economics, we still encounter this argument that when we get back to growth, and when the economy is back in growth again, And I always remember about 3 years ago on Radio 4 in the morning hearing Sir Martin Sorrell, who's always wheeled out as this great economics expert, although he always seems to be wildly wrong every time. And he said, this was in 2009, and he said, well, we'll experience an economic downturn for a couple of years, but then when we get into the Winter Olympics and the World Cup in 2010, then everything will be all right. It goes in cycles, and there was this lovely idea that the global economy goes in cycles based on international sporting tournaments. I don't think that the 2012 Olympics is going to be the thing that's going to pull us out of this. So we look at all of those things, and through that, we argue that two things are really, really important, and I think they're two really big and important ideas. So the first one of those is the idea of resilience, and that's an idea which will be explored after this in a panel which starts at 3 or 3:30 in here. It's out there on the board. But I think resilience is a really, really important idea, and it moves beyond, not quite beyond, but it sort of builds on the idea of sustainability in that when we're looking at making places more sustainable, we also need to look at making them more resilient and more able to withstand shocks. And Ian Dowie, who used to be the manager of Crystal Palace Football Club, used to define resilience as being bounce-back ability. And how do we have that bounce-back ability in our communities when they encounter that? But what we do in Transition, I think, is to take a next step along in terms of talking about resilience and say it's not just about having communities that are able to weather shock and withstand shock. It's also about seeing that, putting in place the ability to do that as having enormous potential for the economies of the places that we live. So at the moment we're hugely dependent on very long fossil fuel intensive supply chains for the food that we eat, but actually the process of putting food resilience back could actually be the economic making of a place, or part of the economic rethinking and making of a place. The other idea is of localisation, which I think is one of the really big ideas of our time, really. That as we move away from the dependence on cheap energy and all that makes possible, putting in place a new economy that meets more of its own needs is going to be a really big thing. And this idea of localization as economic development is one of the things that we're really looking at in the whole transition idea. So in terms of how much of that is actually possible, one of the things we did in the book was to look at food and building materials and energy, and argued that we could probably be looking at sort of 70–80% of food needs being met with a more, we're always going to import, we're always going to export, but actually as a country we could meet a lot more of our food needs. And in terms of energy, I think that's harder because the degree of renewable energy infrastructure that we need is going to be hugely expensive, and as communities, even if we have the most spectacularly successful community share options, we're not going to be able to raise more than enough for about a quarter of the infrastructure, but as much of that in community ownership as possible, because it's about plugging the leaks of our economies, trying to enable more money to cycle locally. So what I wanted to do to start off with was to just give you some stories about what people have been doing. So Transition's been going about 5 years. There are people here in the audience who've been active within their communities doing this for a good part of that, who have stories that maybe they can tell at the end. But I want to just tell some of the stories that we've pulled back in. And I did a talk a while ago where there was no electricity and I couldn't use PowerPoint, and so I thought, well, we'll turn that to an advantage. And I asked a lot of projects who've been doing really interesting things to send me props. And so it looked a bit like a car boot sale, but actually each of these props here has a story to tell. And so I want to I want to tell you those stories. And then what we're going to do afterwards is the next bit, which one might normally do with PowerPoint, you're going to do. So we're going to have a kind of an interactive process where you're going to teach each other the next bit that comes after this. This is a flyer from Tooting in London, and this is a flyer for the Trash Catchers Carnival. And when we'd been doing Transition not for very long, some people came down to Totnes from Tooting and said, how do we do Transition in Tooting? You know, we're a very big population, very diverse population, high social deprivation in the area. What's the best way to do it? We said, we've got absolutely no idea. You figure it out, and it'd be really interesting to know what you come up with. So they went away and they thought about it. And then what they came up with, one of the things that they've come up with was the Trash Catchers Carnival. And it was the idea of a community celebration that brought everybody together to look at celebrating the earth, the ideas around transition in a very creative kind of a way. They were the first transition project to get funding from the Arts Council, and it was a street carnival with about 1,000 people involved in it. They used about 1 million old plastic bags and crisp packets. They used half a ton of willow. They made these extraordinary things. It was local schools, local mosques, local churches, temples, everybody. It was an extraordinary celebration of the place. They had huge problems getting permission to block off the high street in Tooting because they were a red route through London, and Transport for London said not on your Nelly, and the local council said not on your Nelly. So in the end they had to go to the local police station and announce their intention to demonstrate. And so the police said, well, what are you marching against? They said, nothing. And then with about 3 days left to go before when it looked like it might not be happening, and they had all these 6-metre high animatronic things all in a shed ready to go, and everybody all with all their costumes ready to go, they were told, well, you can do it, but you'll have to pay the policing bill. It'll be about £50,000. Have you got £50,000? And then the head of the local police in Tooting said, we'll pay for it. Out of our community policing policy, we see this as such an important thing that's happening here. And you can see film on YouTube of the event itself, absolutely extraordinary celebration of the place and so on. And at the end, when they had the day after, so then they did demonstration, the carnival, they got to the end of this big field, local restaurants fed 1,000 people for nothing, and the next day they had a big sort of meeting where they looked at what the learnings from it, and one of the key things was, if we can do that, we can do anything. And that's one of the really brilliant sort of motivations to create in a place, I think. This horrible jumper, actually Christy could probably tell you more about this than I can, but I'll have a go, and if I miss out on anything, you can tell me about it. So this jumper comes from Tooting. No, it doesn't. It comes from Taunton in Somerset. And Transition Taunton, from quite early on, have been working very closely with the local council. And one of the things they did that was fantastic was they had a very good connection with someone very high up in the council who invited them to come and do visioning work with the council. And visioning is one of the things that's really big in transition. You know, what's the point of talking about a low carbon future if actually none of us can imagine what it would look like? And I always think one of the reasons that Copenhagen failed was all those people who went to Copenhagen on our behalf to negotiate for the future that we all wanted couldn't really imagine what that was. If you said to them, describe it to me, what would it smell like, sound like, feel like? Don't know. And so one of the things they did, they got everybody in the council, it wasn't just a few people, everybody who worked for the council, all 375 people, from the chief executive officer, the planners, down to the guys who cut the grass and mind the car parks, all came together for a number of sessions to look at what a resilient post-carbon Taunton would look like. They produced a fantastic report called Towards a Resilient Taunton Dean, but it's gone on from then to really kind of infiltrate the work that the council did. And this jumper comes from a day that the council ran. They reduced their electricity use by 14% and started all kinds of initiatives within the council. But this was a day they had which was a turn off the heating day in the winter at work. They turned off the heating in the offices, and then they gave a prize for whoever wore the most unpleasant jumper to work. I don't know if this one won, but there were probably some even worse jumpers. But that thing of actually trying to get in and sort of affect the DNA of places in that way is really, really important, not bludgeon them over the head for what they're not doing. In London, so the way that transition works in cities isn't having something called Transition London that basically tries to do the whole city. It works on a neighbourhood by neighbourhood level. It works on a scale over which people feel they can have an influence. And this is rather sweet. This is from Belsize in London. So we've got a little door. And then a little man draft-proofing the door. And a little window here. These are the kind of windows they have a lot of in that part of London. And these are the people who are draft-proofing the windows. So this is a project in Belsize called Draft Busters, which they inherited from a local low-carbon group. But it's quite a very simple idea. You know, you go around to people's houses. The council provides you with the materials to draft-proof windows and doors. It's a kind of a coming together of people.